you have to understand that Canada values, the relationship that we have in terms of our men and women in uniform serving shoulder to shoulder with each other. And I think that there's a lot of people that are just going, how did this happen and why?
The Conservatives spent much of the week hammering the government on the Omar Khadr settlement, except this time they took their message on the road to the United States. You just saw Michelle Rempel appearing on the most watched news channel in the U.S., Fox News. Pierre Poilievre also did an on-camera interview for a popular Conservative website, and there was this scathing editorial penned in the Wall Street Journal by MP Peter Kent with the title, "A Terrorist's Big Payday," courtesy of Trudeau. Now, the mini media blitz caused a short-lived spike in U.S. Google searches about Omar Khadr, and it certainly didn't escape the attention of the Trudeau Liberals. They are accusing the opposition of hurting Canada at the NAFTA table with their Khadr campaign. The Conservatives say it's the Liberals who have done the damage. Our Sunday Scrum is back to try and make sense of all of this. Joining me today from Ottawa are freelance columnist Susan Riley and John Ibbitson of the Globe and Mail. Joining us from Calgary is Rob Beckenridge of News Talk 770, and he also writes a regular political column for the Calgary Herald. So, Susan, let's begin with you. Who is the so-called U.S. campaign ultimately aimed at? What do you think the Conservatives are hoping to achieve here?
That's a really good question, Natasha. I mean, clearly it's aimed at bolstering Canadian outrage against the Khadr settlement. The Conservatives have grasped this issue. They sense that there is a lot of unease about it, and they're, riding it for all it's worth. In this case, though, crossing the border with the issue, I think, is really irresponsible. The goal, obviously, is to hurt the Trudeau government's reputation, but they really do risk hurting Canada's reputation in the eyes of the most devout Trumpites. I don't think you're going to turn America against Canada based on this one decision. That's not going to happen. But it strikes me, I think the government has got good reason to complain about this. And certainly when NDP members went down to Washington a few years back to lobby against the Keystone Pipeline, they were accused of treason by the then Conservative government. So there's a lot of hypocrisy at play here, too. I think it's a bad, distasteful move on the part of the Conservatives.
Okay, well, the Liberals certainly felt the same way. They took notice. They weren't happy. Environment Minister Catherine McKenna let that be known on Twitter. So she tweeted, "The U.S. announces NAFTA goals, and the Conservative Party MPs are in the U.S. talking Khadr with alt facts. Irresponsible. Millions of Canadian jobs at stake." But the Conservative leader, Andrew Scheer, said McKenna's reaction was just another diversion by the Liberals. So let's have a look at that.
The responsibility for any of the negative outcomes of the Omar Khadr payout lies with the Liberals. It was their choice to, first of all, make the payment over and above the compensation that Omar Khadr already received when he was repatriated to Canada. It was their decision to unroll it in the bizarre fashion that they did. And the only people now who are trying to make this assertion are the Liberals themselves. And this comes on the heels of them desperately trying to deflect blame to others. It's not credible to think that somehow the news and commentary in Canada stops at the U.S. border. I don't know that anybody actually believes that.
So, Rob, we certainly know that this is a story that does involve people in the United States, and people have paid attention. What do you make of the response?
Well, it's kind of awkward for the Liberals to argue that, let's all keep quiet and hopefully the Americans don't notice, because if they do, they're going to get mad. If they're concerned that this might have some negative repercussions in Washington, then they should be out making the case and connecting with lawmakers directly. I mean, it was interesting, wasn't it, just a couple of days after word emerged about this settlement that Donald Trump was heaping praise on Justin Trudeau at the G20 summit. But I think that is an issue for the Liberals. Look, people here, certainly in Canada, are upset about this. I think the Conservatives have realized that. They've tapped into that. And I think this is part of their effort to embarrass the government and remind Canadians that maybe they've made a real serious misstep here. It is dangerous, I suppose, to some extent, if you're going to misrepresent this in the United States and fan the flames of some of that anger or frustration that might exist in Washington. That could be problematic. And I do think the Conservatives need to be careful in terms of what they hope to achieve by going on American media and pressing the case in Washington about this, that it could backfire. So I think that there is some risk inherent in that strategy. But at the end of the day, for the Liberals to argue that this could hurt us if the Americans find out about it, then they need to be careful too.
John, it was just last week. You and I were talking about the Omar Khadr payout. We're talking about the political fallout from this. Trudeau government has said repeatedly, because the Prime Minister keeps getting asked about this, and no matter where he is, why did you pay him out? Why did you give him this much? And the Prime Minister is sticking to two lines, which is it's the right thing to do, and we violated the guy's rights. And then he says, look, we would have lost a lot more money had we moved forward. But it's not working. It's not working with the reporters. They keep asking. It's clearly not working with the Conservatives, and even not with some Liberal supporters. So what do you think he has to say? How does he make this go away?
There's no way to make this go away except with the mercy of time. Look, the Conservative strategy is a successful strategy of going to the States and stirring up the pot on Fox News and in the Wall Street Journal. Why do we know it's a successful strategy? Because we're talking about Omar Khadr again. And the whole point of it was not to stir up American anger and the Liberal notion that this is going to somehow infect the NAFTA negotiations is nonsensical, as though the negotiating teams that are going to be meeting in Washington in August will suddenly find the Khadr issue on the table while they're discussing supply management and government procurement. That's just silly. But the Liberals are looking for something, anything that they can find, that will distract attention from the world of hurt they're experiencing on the Khadr file. Again, I say for the thousandth time, they made the right decision in settling. They were legally compelled to, and they saved the taxpayers some money. But there's no good way to message this. It's summer. There's nothing else on the plate. The Conservatives are doing a very good job of keeping the issue alive, and all the Liberals can do is just pray for Labor Day.
Susan, I just want to get your sense on this, because is part of the logic, not just on the part of the Conservatives, to attack the Liberals here in Canada, but also hurt his global image, hurt the Prime Minister's global image, because while he might get criticized here at home, everywhere else he goes, people want to take selfies and they think he's a bit of a rock star. They always talk about how dreamy looking he is, all that stuff. Do you think this is it, in a way, to get at that image of him?
Yes, I do. It's an indirect way, but I think you're absolutely right, Natasha. It's less. It is about Khadr, but you're right. It's about trying to knock down Trudeau's rock star image. But against these complaints on American television, which very few Canadians probably saw, we had the Prime Minister conspicuously enjoying the Gay Pride March in Halifax this weekend. I mean, he's a very compelling. He presents a very compelling image. It's an image that's attractive to a lot of younger Canadians, Atlantic Canadians, some of the women, some of the groups that Andrew Scheer has said his party has to make inroads with. I mean, Mr. Scheer, when he was first elected, said, we've got to present a positive vision of conservatism. And this Khadr tactic is not part of that. I don't see that working at all.
Rob, I want to address something, and let's get your opinion on this. Because one thing seems clear in all of this, and that's Andrew Scheer's party believes that voters will make the Liberals pay for the settlement at the polls. And is that a sound assessment? Because at least one poll suggests it's not, and one does. So the Liberal support is virtually unchanged since the settlement was announced. This, despite another poll, and that was by Angus Reid, that suggests that 71% of Canadians, that's regardless of political affiliation, were uncomfortable with the payout and the way the payout was carried out. So you're a host on a show, people call in. What are you hearing from your listeners?
Well, it was a lot of anger and a lot of frustration. I haven't really seen an issue like this. I mean, you go back over the years. I can recall in 2008, for example, when we had the coalition crisis. I mean, people were furious. Hadn't seen an issue like that, where day after day besieged with phone calls and emails. And this was something approaching that. I think the government really misjudged the public mood on this. For the most part, look, it's not as though we were talking about Omar Khadr a month ago. People weren't stewing in their juices because he was walking around free in Canada. I think people had more or less moved on, that say, okay, look, this young man made some mistakes. Maybe we made some mistakes too. Let's move on. Let's turn the page on this. This guy wants to get on with his life, and let's hope for the best. I think that's where a lot of Canadians were at, and people felt blindsided by this. This seemed to come out of nowhere, and the government did a horrible job explaining this. I mean, we went days and days without any kind of an explanation from the government, nothing from the Prime Minister. So they really did a poor job of, I think, communicating this to Canadians, explaining why they felt they had to do it, maybe explaining to Canadians what those legal analyses were that led them to that conclusion. And some of the numbers being thrown around, the Trudeau suggesting that maybe this would have cost $40 million had we continued to fight it. I mean, some of that seemed preposterous. So Yeah, they did a terrible job. It's almost surprising that it hasn't yet hurt them in the polls, and maybe that speaks to Canadians not yet fully understanding or trusting this new Conservative leader. But is this going to have a longer-term impact? As John says, I mean, the Liberals are hoping this goes away, and maybe it does. But I guess the question for them that should trouble them is that, what if it doesn't?
Well, John, sorry, Susan, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I completely agree with Rob's analysis, too, about how most Canadians probably feel about this deal. Blindsided and maybe a bit shocked by the amount of money involved, but essentially ready to give Khadr a chance. I think that's the sense I get anyway. But I agree with you that I agree with Rob that the Liberals really mishandled this. I mean, you don't do something, you don't refuse to do something because it's unpopular. If something is right, it's right, whether it's unpopular or not. Trudeau should have said that, explained why the government was doing what it was doing, and just stopped there. Instead, he went on to say he felt unease about the settlement, and he more or less was speaking out of both sides of his mouth, and I thought it was very unbecoming, actually. You either stand up for rights and for what you believe is right, or you don't. And he tried to play both sides, and he ended up looking like a vacillator.
Well, speaking to something, sorry, John, go ahead.
Every political party has a negative brand, something about people, something about the party that bothers people. And with the Liberals, the negative part of the Liberal Party is elite condescension, that we are the party of journalists and professors and artists and the like, and the rest of you are ignorant and don't understand the complexities of the situation and need to be ignored or talked down to. When the Liberals are in that mode, they are infuriating. And again, it is a question of messaging, not about the propriety of the settlement itself. It's just that they've struck people once again as the arrogant, condescending Liberals, and it's driving people nuts. It's a messaging thing.
Well, it's what Rob was saying about the amount of phone calls he's received. I mean, I'm very active on Twitter. I've never received the kind of tweets and anger I've seen about this. On both sides of the equation, people feel very strongly about this. And for those who are uncomfortable with the government's decision to pay out, much of it had to do with the fact that it happened late at night. And we discussed this last week as well. The check is handed over, it's cashed immediately. It seemed like they didn't want the public to find out about this and didn't address it publicly until 2 to 3 days afterwards. I mean, we only found out because there was a leak of some sort. So that also made it very uncomfortable for the Prime Minister and how he was managing it, which is something that Susan was speaking to. And I know folks are going to tweet at all of us again about this topic, but we do have to move on because there's so much more ahead on the Sunday Scrum. We're going to talk about Andrew Scheer's shadow cabinet and how it's starting to take shape. He announced his appointments for his House leadership team this week.